what God has called us to, a standard, which means faith. And here's the important thing: faith is the measuring standard of how we regard ourselves. And faith, in that sense, is a shorthand, what Paul would use over and over again, is a shorthand for us to appreciate the fact that we belong to the one who redeemed us in view of God's mercy. In view of God's mercy, I appeal to you, offer yourselves. You go back to chapter 6. We saw this multiple times in the last couple of weeks. You went back to chapter 6, and you will see that Paul brings this whole climax, or rather brings this point to a climax where he sketches what is going wrong in the world when people decide to live for themselves, their own means and their own objectives, their own goals and purposes. And the whole world is in a mess. And he says in chapter 6, you used to live that way, but no longer should you consider living that way. And then there's this exposition on the grace of God. By the mercy of God, he's brought us together. He's reconciled us to God and each other because of what Christ has done on the cross. And that's a starting point. In the view of mercy, in the view of the mercy of God, offer your lives to God. Faith is the standard by which we regard ourselves. And so Paul, in one sense, is using that as the benchmark, but we should bear in mind that he uses that as a benchmark and then invites us to deal with one another in the light of how we respond to God in faith. And it's important to think about it this way, because when you go into the following chapters, chapter 13 and chapter 14, especially in chapter 14, we begin to see where Paul is saying that those who are stronger in their faith must deal with those who are weaker in their faith a certain way. So here's the thing. There is a standard by which we consider ourselves, and then based on that, we start serving one another, and we serve with one another. And that's why Paul would say, the more we appreciate the grace of God, the less we will boast about ourselves, and the more we will start looking outside of ourselves and consider others because of Jesus Christ. And that's what you will see happen as you look at the rest of this passage. Because he says, each of us must think with sober assessment of ourselves according to the standard, the measure of the faith God has assigned to all of us. And then we start dealing with each other because we are a people of faith. And so as he continues in verse 4, he says, just as each of us, as in one body, we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function. So we, though are many, are all one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. Now, here is something very important. When we begin to serve together, we must appreciate that while we are called to do things as a body, it's important we appreciate that we don't always do the same things, and we're not necessarily called to do the same thing. Now, here is a place where we invariably end up being disappointed with each other and with church. We end up being disappointed because we don't see others participate in what we are doing the way we are doing it. We are a communal people, and therefore we like to do things together. But it's very difficult to be encouraged to press on doing what God's called us to do. And therefore, Paul is saying, I want you to remember, for as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function. So we, though many, are one body and individually members of one another. So take what you do as an individual as a means of encouraging others. And you do that by participating in the life of one another. You do that by being present with one another. It's not always easy to be present and participate, but here is where the analogy of the body comes to play. The analogy of the body is an invitation to remember that no matter how disconnected you feel, you are never disconnected. And you must not seek to be disconnected. And Paul then leans into 7 different aspects, and we would look at them, having gifts that differ according to the, here's a phrase again, grace given to us. Let us use them in proportion to faith, and you will see how that plays out in a bit. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith, in our serving, the one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in generosity, the one who leads with zeal, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. Look at what Paul is saying over here. Look at the way he articulates this. He says to belong to Jesus Christ means you belong to one another in a local community, in a church. Now, I want you to kind of imagine this when Paul is writing, right? When Paul is writing to the Christians in Rome, he's not writing to a place where a people gather together as a congregation like we are doing now. And he's not referring to them as individuals. Rather, he's writing to people who are scattered throughout Rome. But on occasion, they come together. And he is saying, here's how you grow as the body of Christ. When you come together, you bring what God has given you and you use it, the phrase, according to the principle of faith, according to the measure of faith. In other words, God has given something to you and you learn to be faithful. Okay, I'm going to pause for a bit over here because I don't know if you can still hear me. The congregation screen that I had on just died. So, and I can only see the screen that Jenny uses. Okay, there's a chat. Okay, you can hear me, but I can't see you. But so I'll continue. The computer turned off. All right. As long as you can hear me, that's fine. But I would like to see you as well. So as I was saying, what Paul is compelling us to do is to both pause and consider how we might reflect God's mercy with gratitude back to him, and consider what that reflecting that mercy back to God, offer yourselves as a sacrifice, living holy and pleasing to God, right? How does reflecting that gratitude to God is lived out in community? And so this metaphor of the body, Paul uses that repeatedly, uses that over here. You see that in Romans 12. You will see that also in 1 Corinthians. You will see that in Ephesians. And he keeps coming back to according to the grace that God has given us. Worship, then, you should realize, and you would have probably picked this up by now, the worship of God and the belonging together and serving one another and serving together are all intricately intertwined. And here's the thing. The first example Paul gives for worship in action is about the way we encourage one another. It's not about worship through song or prayer or even petition. So the 7 examples that Paul gives us are all examples of worship. Because if you went back, you would realize he would say this. This is your your spiritual worship, offering your lives as a sacrifice, holy and pleasing and acceptable to God. This is your spiritual worship. And then he says, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed. And by the grace of God, think of yourself in such a way that you will worship. And now I'm going to paraphrase Paul from the larger context of the way he writes. Worship, and leaning into what Jesus would say in John 4, worship in truth and in spirit is how we deal with one another because of the mercy that God has extended to us. And so he says, if prophecy, according to the principle of faith, whatever we mean by prophecy, there's a lot that is out there, and there's plenty. It's not unidirectional, or nor is it of just one dimension. It's a multi-dimensional, multi-directional, aspect when it comes to prophecy. But what it does mean at base is some kind of engagement with each other as a people of God, mediating God's encouragement to one another. The one who does this, now here's the thing, the one who speaks on behalf of God to encourage others can do that to magnify themselves. But Paul is saying, use this according to the principle of faith, meaning knowing full well that the gift you have been given is something that you are called to use in a way in which it blesses the people of God, so that the people of God can be a blessing as God has chosen them to be in the world. And you can see how that phrase, according to the principle of faith, could actually be repeated for everything. If serving, let him serve, not so that he can draw attention to himself, but according to the principle of faith. If encouraging, let encouragement be done according to the principle of faith. If it's contribute to the needs of the other according to the principle of faith. If it's leadership, lead, govern diligently according to the principle of faith. If it's showing mercy, do so cheerfully according to the principle of faith. The point I want to make, and I think it's important for us to remember, especially as a congregation at this stage in our life, is this: how are we to think of ourselves? What does it mean for us to think of ourselves with sober thinking? And remember, I said I could have titled this morning's sermon, Serving One Another in Grace. But instead, I chose to title this as Serving Together in Grace. And here's why I did that. The governing principle, it seems, the way Paul is writing this, and he's writing this to the church that is in Rome, the Christians in Rome, the governing principle seems to me that we use our gifts in such a way that we express our faith collectively, not only to encourage and edify and build one another up, but as we are encouraging and building one another up, to serve the world that God has placed us in, the community God has placed us in. And here is my contention, here is my reason why I think that's the case. Because if we don't do that, then there is nothing that is going to keep us from becoming a self-serving people. The more we limit ourselves to ourselves, we can be all loving and caring and gracious and wonderful towards one another. But the more we do that and insulate ourselves from the needs of the world that God has placed us in, the community that God has placed us in, we will not only become blind to what is around us, we will become without us realizing, self-seeking and self-serving people. I remember being in one of our meetings as a team of evangelists a couple of years ago, and we were joking, uh, and I'm grateful that it was a joke the way we meant it, but we were joking. Part of what happens when we gather together as evangelists and meet together in fashion where we kind of look at what's happening and what we've been doing, and all of that, sharing our stories of the different meetings we've had and the people who've come to faith and so on and so forth. It almost sounded like I said, I'm grateful it was said in jest. It almost sounded like, I'm so tired of saying how good I am. I'm going to pause for a moment and let you start talking about how wonderful I am. If we lose sight that God graciously blesses us with the privilege of being a body, when we, for whatever reason, whether it is discouragement or whether it is just fatigue or just plain old monotony that has creeped in, when we stop serving one another according to the principle of faith, which compels us as a community to serve together in grace. If for whatever reason we lose sight of that, then it's only a matter of time before we become a self-seeking and a self-serving people. Which is why the gifts that Paul speaks about are all gifts that is exercised in the public space. Prophesy, serving, teaching, encouraging, contributing, leading, showing mercy. They're all exercised in a community, in public, not in private. Because that should be the character of the people of God in the public space. Serving one another and serving together as Christ served the church. And so, humbled by grace, the only way to offer our lives as a sacrifice that is living, holy, and pleasing to God, the only way to do that is to serve with the same measure that has been given to us, the grace that is given to us. We not only receive it, but with grateful hearts, we extend it to each other, and that we gather collectively as a community, we extend to the world out. So we're not only here as a congregation to serve one another, but we are here as a congregation to serve together in grace. May God bless us as you continue to reflect on His word to us this morning.